Welcome back. Now we have a session by Ms. Laura Puttkamer on SDG11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, Best Practices Case Studies. Ms. Laura Puttkamer is a journalist and consultant, participatory. She is an urban development expert passionate about participation in urban planning. She supports planning professionals and community leaders in developing and implementing participatory methods. Her investigative and culturally sensitive approach enables her to find tailor-made solutions for communities. Her work is focused on projects in urban planning that promote participatory approaches. In 2017, she finished her master's degree in global urban development and planning at the University of Manchester. Thank you, Ms. Laura, for joining us today. Over to you for your session.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining. I know it's been a long conference so far and full of many innovative and amazing ideas, I'm sure. So I will try to keep my presentation relatively short, because I know that in India, where some of you are at least, it's quite late already, right? I think it's after midnight. So what I've tried to do is I have made a presentation of some case studies for sustainable cities from all over the world. And I'll focus on the pictures because I don't want to bombard you with too much information right now, but I'm including all the relevant links here. So these case studies I've either seen personally or written about because I also work as a journalist. And yes, this works. So I would just like to share some case studies and best practice studies from cities all over the world with you, because so often people ask, what actually makes a city sustainable? How does a city look when it is sustainable? And many people don't even realize where to look for sustainable solutions or how to recognize any interesting green innovations or solutions in their own city. So I'm going to try to make that a little bit clearer today, hopefully. And then I'll give you some case studies, and there will be a bit of time for questions if you have any. So let's jump in. Sustainable cities, they are the ones that do follow SDG11, but that can be kind of abstract, especially from the perspective of citizens, which is what I focus on mostly. Another thing is the new urban agenda. So almost all of the countries we have 5 years ago signed the new urban agenda and committed to making their cities more green, more inclusive, more participatory. But again, that's something that for citizens kind of on the ground is really hard to understand what that actually means. Similar for the Paris Agreement, as important as it is, I think it's important also to consider how does it translate into real life? How can you create the enthusiasm that's necessary among all kinds of actors and all kinds of stakeholders, right? Including the citizens, but then also SMEs, private companies, NGOs, international organizations. And we do come together and see 40 cities, and mayors have these local agendas in many cities, and hoping to create something that's green and smart and resilient. I think a first step, if you want to check how sustainable your city already is, would be to check if it has a local agenda 2030, to not get overwhelmed by all these international agreements that we have, but to see what your city actually wants to implement. Because again, the solutions look very different for each individual city, right? So you can see what your own city is going to do. I know that in India, there's a lot of smart cities, and I recommend always researching very specifically for your own city or even your own district within a big city, what's actually happening. It usually comes down to commitment and to political will, but also a lot to investments and also to civic initiatives. So these are things to look into if you want to understand how sustainable your own city is already, what can be done, what's happening, what are interesting initiatives that you can maybe participate in or even start yourself. So there are some research pointers in the end. And I've done this for a few cities, but first, because in my work I focus on participation, I would actually like to ask you, and I think you could share in the comments, which solutions do you have in your own city? If you could briefly just type in the box what your city is, and if you can think of any sustainable green solutions, go ahead, let us know. Here in the graphic, you can see some examples for nature-based climate solutions, for example. So your city might have some green approaches, some waterfront regeneration, for example. These would be good examples for making a city more sustainable. Trying to see in the chat feel free to share. If no one is able to share at the moment, that's no problem either. I'm just trying to get you to think a little bit about your own city, because sometimes in all these communications, we forget to then bring it back home, right? I'm going to give you a second.
I can see wastewater management, renewable energy in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Aparna. Somehow I can't see that. If you can see anything else, can you please read it out? I can see a chat to the right, but the last thing was posted an hour ago. We'll continue. Thank you, everyone, for sharing. I think it's really valuable to just stop the discussion for a moment, usually, and kind of bring this topic home a bit. And it sounds like there's some interesting things going on in your cities. I'm German, but I actually usually live in London. I'm currently in Germany right now, so I'm traveling back and forth a bit. But I'm starting this with London because it's my own city at the moment. I looked into the sustainable city plan that London has for itself, and I found it quite interesting. And most of it I can actually see manifested in the city itself. So London is aiming to be carbon neutral by 2030. It used to be 2050, but now they're going to move that date forward, and it's going to be 2030, hopefully. The strategy is from the year 2018, but they also updated it every year. And what I found really interesting is all the different areas of life they focus on, because they start with the diet, for example. And I think most of us, if we think of sustainable cities, we wouldn't think of the citizens' diet as part of that, but actually it very much is, because it depends on agriculturally where your food comes from, if there's any community gardens, for example, in the city, how much waste the food creates, how much CO2 emissions the food creates in its transport, especially in the last mile. And the first mile. So these are quite interesting issues to look into when considering a sustainable city in terms of diet and food. Energy is more popular, of course, as a topic of sustainability in cities. We've got waste, which is a huge issue in London. I was surprised, actually, because you always think of London as such a progressive city, but they actually really struggle with their waste collection. Transport is another issue, and that I think is something that London does particularly well, but also a lot of cities now during COVID, with all the new cycling lanes, for example, and a new focus that citizens have, but also politicians have, to provide more active transport modes and to provide more green spaces and better ways for citizens to get from A to Z. That's quite an interesting development. And another thing that London in particular is looking into is how to deal with extreme weather events. And just a few months ago, we had some big floods, for example, that the city is not equipped for at all. So that's something that urgently has to be tackled. And then also the city is aiming to create high impact changes in behavioral needs. And there, which I also found quite interesting, is that they're tackling organizations over individuals. So London is saying, hey, we don't want to shame you. We don't want to create all this guilt among our citizens. We actually want to focus on organizations because they can make a much bigger impact with their actions. They already have a much bigger impact, and they are also the ones where a lot of change needs to happen. And I know that a lot of our audience today is interested in SMEs or working with and for SMEs. So I think that's an approach that's worth looking at. Or whenever someone talks to you about sustainable cities, ask yourself and ask themselves, are you aiming to change the behavior of individuals or of companies? And how can you do that? And what are the differences between these two? And another question is, do you focus on adaptation or mitigation? Of course, that's always in this area one of the big questions. Another example here I have is Singapore. Singapore, as I'm sure you're aware, always gets quoted as one of the best examples for sustainable cities. What I found particularly innovative is the water reuse system of the city. So by now, about 2/3 of the city's rooftops are used for collecting water, because the city is trying to not let a single drop of water go to waste. That means rainwater is captured, it's prepared, and then it's being used again. So the whole thing works as a cycle. I've included a link here, so I think we can share the slides later probably, and then you can have a look and read the details. But that's another very good approach of creating a more sustainable, a greener city. Then we have an example from Africa, which has a lot of great examples, but I always criticize the fact that so many people don't really look into, especially sub-Saharan African countries, for solutions. In Freetown, for example, they're calling themselves the Tree Town. So they They wanted to plant 1 million trees in 2020. I do think that the pandemic disrupted that a little bit, and they're still looking for funding for the last few trees. But about 2/3 of these 1 million trees have already been planted. And as part of this initiative, the mayor, who's a really interesting character, she decided to have no more Christmas tree displays in the cities and to put up lights instead that are powered by green electricity. So that's kind of a smaller initiative, you would think at first, because whether Freetown puts up 20 Christmas trees in its city center or not might not make the biggest impact or difference in terms of CO2. But I think it's something that the media cover, and from my journalistic and consultant perspective, I think it's really important to signal, send out these symbols, right? To signal we are willing to make changes, we are going to offer you a greener alternative. And that's something that catches the public's attention. And it's really important to also work with these approaches, even if they're not always the most impactful. So it's good to find a balance, of course, because in the end, we're always looking for maximum impact. But if it then works well for the media, if it can be shared on social media, that's another thing to consider, more and more important these days. I used to live in Mexico City, and one of my favorite examples there is that on this huge, it's kind of the city center circular highway. On these kind of multi-level tiers of a freeway, which is horrible. It's very gray. It's full of cars. Very bad air quality. They made the pillars green. It's called Via Verde, the green path. But the question is, what do these plans actually achieve? So there's about 150 of these pillars that are already green, like this. They have endemic plants that are local, native to Mexico. They're being watered every day, but they're designed to not use a lot of water. But the question is, do they really clean the air? And I looked into it in one of my articles I wrote, and in the end, again, I would say it has a very high visual impact. It might also have a good psychological impact, because there are some studies that say that the stressed out drivers of Mexico City actually relax a bit when they see these green pillars. But in terms of air quality, these are not even scratching the surface, right? Because in the end, it's just a few small plants and they're not doing a lot. But every person who drives through Mexico City is bound to see these. So it can also be used as a cover by politicians, so it can be a bit dangerous, but it does send an important signal. And then we need people and journalists to actually dig deeper and ask, okay, this might be a start and it's very visual, but what does it actually do, and what else can we do, even if it might be a little bit more boring visually or even invisible. Another example, so here I'm jumping to Europe, is Copenhagen. It always gets quoted as one of the greenest cities in the world. It's going to be carbon neutral with its transport by 2025, and also the bus fleet is going to be fully electrified by 2025. They also have already pedestrianized the city center, and I've been several times. I can attest it's a joy as a pedestrian, as a citizen, to just walk there and to be appreciated so much. But then also, European cities have layouts in many cases that make it a bit easier to pedestrianize the city center. This does not necessarily work everywhere, but it's really worth looking into this and into the work of the architect Jan Gehl, who himself is Danish, and he's responsible for a lot of this, of these progresses in Copenhagen. And just to read about his philosophy and the importance of pedestrians and his strive to make everyone a pedestrian. Because in the end, we all are, even if we're just walking to our cars or to the next bus. That's really worth looking into, and then trying to see how you can apply that to your own city or even your own company. Then lastly, I have an example from Melbourne, because there what I really liked is that the government is so committed to creating attention and then actually following that up with very impactful action. So what they do is they turn a lot of the pop-up parks they have into communication forums to actually talk to the citizens. So they create a pop-up park or a parklet, and then they ask, would you like this to be permanent? So they go a step further. They do not just cover up the issue by saying, okay, we'll have a nice pop-up for a year. They actually use it to make a big impact, and that I think is extremely important. And also the government itself in Melbourne is supporting large climate strikes, and the citizens show up, and there's a lot happening there. So another city to learn from and to look towards. And then I just want to sum up by some pointers, things I've learned in my work on how to implement more sustainability. So of course we need to invest in sustainable solutions, and it does definitely pay off. But we also really need to work with the citizens, because neither politicians nor technicians, such as urban planners, always know best necessarily. Usually the citizens know best, but they don't have the means or the technical knowledge to implement what they need. It's also important to work not only with the governments, but also with the IOs, the international organizations, and NGOs, and then again with the companies, and to really put pressure on our politicians and anyone else in leading positions to make new political commitments. And well, participatory, that's my blog if you want to read more, and I've included some of the sources. And that's it. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, pop them in the chat. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Laura. That was an amazing session. Thank you so much for sharing all those amazing examples and solutions. I think we have a lot to learn from all these stories. And thank you for joining us today. Keep inspiring. We don't have any questions. I don't see any questions. If we have, we'll be sharing it with you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. Have a good day or good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Yeah.